right, y'all, welcome back to Anti-War Radio. It's Chaos 92.7 in Austin, Texas. I'm Scott Horton, and our guest today is Mark Ames. He's a journalist who's written for the New York Press, The Nation, and GQ Russia. He's the founding editor of the Moscow-based The Exile and author of the books Going Postal and The Exile, Sex, Drugs, and Libel in the New Russia. Welcome to the show, Mark.
Thanks for having me on.
I'm very happy to have you here. I really enjoyed this article that you wrote for The Nation, the Cold War that wasn't. Let's hope that's the case, that this thing's dead in the water. And the article is about, obviously, the conflict between Russia and Georgia in the Caucasus Mountains last August, but primarily it's about media coverage of that battle, and particularly the New York Times and the narrative that they spun about that war in defiance of all facts. Why don't you kind of give us the overview here?
Well, basically, the New York Times, and I should add, the New York Times is just one of, many, pretty much every mainstream American media outlet which is guilty of this. They sort of bought hook, line, and sinker into the Georgian/neocon argument that poor, small, democratic little Georgia was invaded by big, evil 19th century Russia for no reason whatsoever, except that Georgia is free and Putin hates freedom. And then basically they spent the next, month or two trying to find evidence that supported this, even when no evidence existed. I mean, for example, they tried pushing, like a lot of people have on Russia and the Kremlin, they tried pushing this idea that Russia launched the first ever cyber war that coincided with a shooting war. And even the article admits there's no evidence of it, but nevertheless, if it is the first instance of cyber warfare, with it marks a new phase in human evil. And basically, Russia has a lot of problems, and Putin has a lot of problems. I mean, he's certainly not somebody who, if you believe in decent things in this world, or you want to spend your life defending. But he's not Hitler, and he's not Stalin, and there's this lobby out there, and it's a very powerful and very loud, shrieking lobby, which for some reason wants to drag us into another kind of Cold War with Russia. I suppose they see Russia as some kind of perfectly convenient enemy, maybe because we supposedly won the Cold War. I'm not sure, but there are a lot of people whose jobs are sort of predicated on this, and whose entire image is based on this. I'm thinking of Fred Hyatt, the opinion page editor of the Washington Post. I mean, this guy is one of the most insanely obsessed Russophobes, imaginable. And with the New York Times, I mean, they try to maintain a slightly more, quote unquote, objective veneer, but their choice of stories and the way that they present these stories, has pretty much the same effect, which is to make readers think that Russia is this insanely aggressive Hitlerian state bent on subjugating its neighbors, and we need to go to war with them. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know what else any of this talk about Munich in the 30s, or selling out Czechoslovakia in 1938, and all of this talk among the neocons leads to, except that we should go to war with Russia. So,
right. I mean, that is supposedly the lesson of Munich, is the war should have started then instead of in September.
Exactly. And, what I also notice is a lot of this is pundit-driven and foreign editor desk-driven. I'll just give you an example. I mean, when I was down in South Ossetia, I got there just as the war was ending and the ceasefire was just taking hold. I was in North Ossetia, so I was on the Russian border side with a small crew of foreign journalists there, Western journalists. Most of the Western journalists were in Tbilisi or in Georgia, where the Georgians ran, a very clever, skillful PR campaign to win over the journalists. But in any event, so what the stringers I was hanging out with, stringers for Time magazine, stringers for the New York Times, writers for all the big papers, what they were being instructed to find by their editors back in Washington or New York were evidence of Russian atrocities against Georgians, ethnic cleansing of Georgians from South Ossetian villages, possible ethnic cleansing of ethnic Georgians from North Ossetia inside of Russia. So, these guys, even the stringers or the reporters who were there were pretty much given instructions from the Home Office to find examples, of evil. And particularly for a stringer, if you're trying to, get a job with the New York Times or build up your resume, you're not going to go against what the foreign desk editor is telling you. You're going to find what he asks to find.
Well, that's a great anecdote. Is that how it usually happens? That's always how I imagine it. Here's what I want you to write, and then that's what they do. Yeah, well,
they'll be slightly more sophisticated than that, but they'll say that's what they want to find. They really weren't interested in upsetting the story. I mean, the truth, which was that the Georgians invaded first. That the Georgians have, the Georgians don't even recognize. Not all Georgians, but certainly the Saakashvili government didn't even recognize that the Ossetians have a genuine grievance and that there's, a centuries-old feud between the Georgians and the Ossetians. From the Georgians' point of view, the Georgians are very chauvinistic, but they're also very, very charming, particularly Saakashvili. I mean, I have a deep fondness for Georgians from the time I've spent there. But you have to see through the BS. And the reality is they invaded the Ossetians. They invaded South Ossetia. Saakashvili had, he had his reasons, and I'm not sure exactly what they were. I have a feeling that that part of it was his megalomania, part of it was, that he might have thought he was getting positive signals from Cheney in that wing of the White House. But I think also, we forget about how domestic politics really drives people, and we always kind of think that we're pushing agendas everywhere. But in fact, Saakashvili is dealing with very serious domestic problems. He's increasingly unpopular. He's increasingly authoritarian. He's alienated pretty much the entire spectrum of the political class by this point. And, how do you stay in power when everybody is turning against you and people want to overthrow you and you're increasingly authoritarian? Well, you start a war with a big enemy who, supposedly was going to invade and occupy and subjugate Georgia. And the result was, sure, he lost the war, but the result is that now to criticize Saakashvili in Georgia is akin to being a Russian stooge and helping bring in, the Russian subjugation of Georgia.
That's funny. That is exactly like it happens in America.
Exactly.
You're objectively pro-Saddam Hussein if you're opposed to this invasion.
Exactly. And the same thing happened with Ukraine. I mean, Yushchenko, the president whose face is all pockmarked and messed up from the dioxin poisoning, he's very unpopular at home. I mean, he's got ratings of under 10% as far as I know, certainly no more than 10%. There's an election coming up, and he is going to battle with his former ally in the Orange Revolution, Yulia Tymoshenko, as well as with the so-called pro-Russian candidate Yanukovych. And so what did he do? He pulled the same move. When the war started, he exploited it. He said that Russia was planning to invade Ukraine next, and then he accused Tymoshenko when she tried to sort of calm things down a bit. He accused her of being a traitor, of bringing the Russians in to invade, Ukraine. Accused Yanukovych of the same thing. So these guys are using this wars to shore up their unpopularity at home, and they have, a common agenda with the neocons. I mean, the neocons, the war in Georgia and the supposed threat against Ukraine, these did more to kind of revive their standing. I don't even know why they have any standing, but in any event, it sort of brought them back to the forefront, a lot of these neocons.
Well, let me stop you right there. So many things I want to follow up on here. Well, really, a ton of things. First of all, just now you mentioned Yushchenko and his face messed up from the dioxin poisoning. Was that just shorthand for so you know what I'm talking about, or is that what you really think happened there, that he was poisoned with dioxin?
No, I do believe it. The Russia and that part of the world is very conspiracy theory. Is very I don't know. It's drowning in conspiracy theories out there, and because people believe so deeply in conspiracy theories, I think probably there are more conspiracies that actually are hatched there. Clever, triple Mobius, double flip conspiracies that are hatched there compared to, let's say, here. But nevertheless, what I've kind of learned over time and what I've learned from Russians who are pretty high up and so on is I think generally you kind of try to go